Hi, Nunana. How are you?
Hi, Jane. It's good to see you. I'm doing well.
Yeah, great. Here we go with another week. I think this is our third month now working from home. So it's a little strange to talk to you over Zoom, rather do it in person, but here we are anyway.
It's true. We've had to make the most of it. And after indeed the third week, it almost starts to feel in a strange way normal.
Yeah, yeah, that is strange, isn't it? But so much is going on, and we decided we wanted to talk together about events that have been going on, and specifically on May 25th, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And that kicked off a lot of emotions and feelings in all of us. But today, yeah, it's really going to be good to hear from you. How were you feeling that day, and what were you thinking right afterwards?
Yeah, for me, this whole thing was a culmination, of course, of a series of activities. I had lived in the U.S. During the advent of the whole smartphone video, and so seeing all these killings, on screens and so on, was something that I've really been feeling personally over a long period of time. One particular moment that really sears in my memory was when Philando Castile was actually shot down in Minneapolis as well. I remember watching that video and it completely broke me. I completely broke down. I was expecting my first child. And so just the idea, somebody getting shot who looks like me in their own vehicle with their daughter in the back seat and their wife, yeah, it completely broke me. And since then, I've not been able to watch a full video of these types of assaults. So, that's something that my mind already immediately went back to that moment. And of course, the month of May was really brutal in the United States with Ahmaud Arbery, who was the jogger who um, was gunned down while jogging, which is something that I do on a daily basis as well. So already I'd been feeling heavy because of that. The woman in Central Park in New York who called the police, purposefully looking to use them, as a weapon, essentially, to come against somebody who is just birding. Um, all of that culminating then with George Floyd. And of course, Breonna Taylor as well. These news stories that just kind of popped up, and the grotesque nature of it. Yeah, it really, just felt like I can't believe, you think you can't believe that this is happening, but it's happening yet again. And then you see the reaction. And so all over the US, all the rioting that was sparked, my own hometown in Grand Rapids, Michigan, also was, vandalized, burning. Have family members in Houston, where that's George Floyd's hometown, and seeing all of that reaction. And then starting to see that it's going global, actually, that protests were being sparked around the world. Um, it really made me feel like this is not normal, that the conversation seems to be shifting. The reaction was different this time compared to what it had been in past times. And that even the rhetoric was changing. So the rhetoric was starting to go around this whole idea of anti-racism, an idea which I knew about before, but um, had never really seen being expressed in such a mainstream way. And so looking at all of that, it really made me feel a little bit, hopeful that maybe this is a moment that has sparked some level of a reaction that we can capitalize on. So to sum it up, really, it was a range of emotions from feeling really, really down from all these killings to, a little bit hopeful, I guess, based on the reaction that I've been seeing. And how is it for you? What are
Yeah,
you thinking
yeah,
about?
good question. Thinking back, I realized, well, George Floyd was killed 2 blocks away from where my niece lives. And my sister-in-law works a lot in Minneapolis as a speech therapist, and specifically, primarily with the community that lives in the general area of Minneapolis, um, yeah, where this terrible thing happened. So immediately, my immediate reaction was when we saw the riots and the burning, well, immediately, let's go back a minute. Okay, another Black man has been killed in the US and the police are involved. And you roll your eyes, you feel sad, you feel bad, and then you move away, or I did, because sadly, it happens way too often. And my attention went to something else. Then I realized that night when the riot started that this was close to my family, and I wrote to my brother and said, how's our niece, what's going on? And then my sister-in-law wrote an account about the families that she serves, being impacted because all the food stores were burned down, they couldn't get food, they needed to move from the community, but they didn't want to leave their faith communities, so they were in a difficult position. Yet families were still calling in for their telehealth sessions to help their kids in the midst of all of these riots. So my immediate reaction was very local and personal, because my family was there and directly involved with people who were directly impacted by the aftermath of the event. So my feelings went really to that. And then to try to help, I realized there were resources that both my niece and sister-in-law pointed out to me. So I wrote to all of our members at schools and universities in Minnesota to say there's actually some great things in place where you can help local people who have been impacted by the aftermath of this event. So that's what happened for me. My thinking immediately went from that event, I guess, and what can I do about that? But maybe I can do something about helping people who are immediately impacted by this event. So that was my own personal reaction. And for CIS, in that moment, didn't occur to me to do any action beyond reaching out to our members, specifically in Minneapolis, where so much immediate destruction was happening as a result in pain in response to the killing of George Floyd.
Yeah. And so, of course, we've had a bit of conversation around this, and I, recall that whole period where, George Floyd was killed, and then the conversation became national, became international, protests were going on, and just seeing, your own reaction, as well as just generally the reaction at CIS, it felt to me almost as if no one seemed to be paying attention to the magnitude of it. Definitely felt very local, as you've said. Really like this is happening in the United States. But when I think about it for myself, I was feeling this pain and this weight as well, just as a Black man yet again, having to deal with another trauma of seeing this happen. And I recall one colleague reaching out to me at CIS and thinking, okay, I mean, that's great. I really appreciated that support that I received, but was wondering, why is it that nobody else has actually asked how I'm doing, whether it was yourself or, we have a whole well-being kind of agenda here as an organization. And so, I was just curious why you think it is that people at CIS just didn't feel comfortable, reaching out to me during this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one, because you and I have been talking a lot about this, that I've asked myself over and over. I'm really sad, but just to say, it never occurred to me to write to you. Because I guess in my own mind, I was focused more on the local events there. And then sadly, because this happens way too often, and again, our own, do I write something to our community? I would say on reflection, there's so many terrible things that happen to people around the world. On one hand, I could write to our community every day about these things that happen to all different sorts of groups. And then I went through in my mind, okay, is this a US race issue that it's CIS's role to write about in the immediate aftermath? And I decided no. And then what happened? What changed? It started spreading around the world. And constantly then I'm thinking, is this something we need to address at CIS? And at the point that it connected with our community, at the point that it became personal for me in a more global, not a local way, was when I read Rachel Engel's letter about how she felt she'd been unprepared for the abuse, the racial abuse she faced after coming out of international education, that her education in a bubble didn't prepare her for that life or give her the skills to deal with it. And then when you wrote your own story, so I knew you were thinking a lot about it and preparing, that definitely made me feel really sad and change the way I was thinking because of those stories and that connection. And it was in actually a very small period of time. It was probably within 48 hours of those two things happening that I said, actually, we do have to address this. We can't just say, okay, global citizenship, intercultural competence, we're covered, you know, all of that comes under this. It was that these are specific instances of trauma and abuse that knowing that, say, oh, has to be addressed, because otherwise, you know, it doesn't mean anything. It's too bland, it's too broad if we don't call out actions that are affecting way too many people. So that's what changed for me. And that's kind of my own personal and professional journey as an individual. And sadly, what my reaction had developed to be over the years. And then as the leader of CIS, in terms of figuring out what do we address and how. It's been, I mean, a couple of things to say. You know, to have this conversation, you know, first of all, it's been really important for me to like listen and learn, because personally, I'm embarrassed and sad that I didn't reach out to you right after these events. And as I said, it really didn't occur to me to specifically make that connection. Why did I not? Yet, because you're my colleague and my friend, you know, when you shared your personal story and how you were feeling about what happened, that did, as you know, made me feel really, really sad and caused me to think in a different way. So going back from structural and systemic racism and going back to say, how do we get people involved in meaningful conversations about what this feels like when we don't have a shared experience? I'm thinking more and more about these personal stories. And it's one reason why I wanted to talk today more openly and even share this conversation, because again, it's not very often in life that your thinking shifts dramatically, even with a couple of days on approach to an issue as big as this one. So I think the most important thing to me now then is, if anti-racism is an effective methodology, tool, or process, you know, how do we use that, but also help other people share their stories so that other people can make meaningful connections to this, and so that we really can make a change. That's what's going through my mind now, so that other people aren't, you know, who else is traumatized? I'm thinking now, like, who else in our own staff may be feeling traumatized about this because of other types of racial or ethnic abuse? And again, to the point, we're talking specifically right now about racial abuse related to the Black Lives Matter movement as a catalyst for tremendous change. So I'm still struggling and need to figure out with more people how to put it all together and address it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that. I think that's a very powerful thing, though, is to continually recognize that for all of us, I don't think there's going to be a destination that will say that, you know, we've arrived. I think we're always going to struggle, and I think we need to be okay with the discomfort, and understand that we're going to sometimes, you know, say the wrong thing or land in the wrong place. But it's from a perspective of indeed trying to motivate that change. So as you're talking about, you know, whether it's identifying other staff members and, you know, how do we support them, or how do we look at structures, you know, it all starts with saying, you know what, yeah, maybe I didn't approach this the right way, and it's time to kind of look at this from a different lens. So in that same vein, I'm curious, you know, where do we go from here? how will you kind of ensure that we as an organization continue to have positive momentum towards anti-racism?
Yeah. So stepping way back, and just because I myself am learning a lot, I realize that we first have to educate ourselves. And to do that, because we don't have as diverse a representation as we could or should at CIS, we want to reach out and invite people from our community to come in and have a dialogue, to look at all the tools and levers at our disposal to make a difference. And I guess one of those will be, first of all, coming up with making sure we use an inclusive process to put together a group of people to work on this. We've talked with our board of trustees last week, and they immediately all agreed that we have to have deeper conversations and a process to look at this, a thoughtful process to listen and learn. So we're going to convene that committee very soon. I'm really glad that you're going to be a part of it too, Nunana, where we first of all say, okay, who are we going to include from our membership community across 122 countries? Obviously, if a working committee has to be representative of diverse perspectives. So we'll do our best to figure out how to do that. Then the second one will be to come up with a scope of work. What are we actually going to set about to do? And then number 3 will be to do that inventory. I'm just thinking out loud here, what are all the ways, tools that we can impact things? You already have set out a number of very powerful ways broadly for international education. Starting organizationally, as I said, with ourselves first, and then broadening out, realizing we can impact, almost 1,400 university and school communities around the world with this work. It's a start. And then beyond that, also working collaboratively. In international education, we all know we work with so many different partners and other groups that impact education. They're all struggling with this too. I've had conversations with leaders of a number of organizations right now, and everybody basically agrees that our response has been insufficient because we still have a lot to listen and learn. And our communities, our staff are pointing that out to, all of us. So, and I think the one big thing that I want to make sure of is that, again, our reaction can't be just a knee-jerk. We're going to come up with a statement overnight and put it out there on our website. That, feels pretty empty to me without having meaningful dialogue, again, about what the steps will be. I think even though we may not come to those steps right away, I am fully committed to communicating openly and regularly about a process we're going to use to try to address this.
Great. So thank you so much for summarizing some of the different ways that we're going to start looking at these types of changes. I'm excited personally to be involved in this. And indeed, as you mentioned, we have the potential to influence a number of organizations and also to create change within our own organization. I was just curious, as a little bit of a follow-up, if there were any specific items that you wanted to highlight. And I understand, this group, we're just convening the group now. We're maybe not ready to, we don't yet know where the group is going to go. But I'm curious if you have your own personal aspirations of where this group could go to create change.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about our definition of global citizenship. Actually, I should say our understanding of it. One of the things that definition, well, why am I thinking about that a lot? There's only 2 things that any institution has to commit to when they join CIS. And it's the reason that people apply for jobs with CIS too. It's the global citizenship piece. It's helping to prepare young people, to live and find their place in this world, wherever that might be. And a commitment to really high quality international education that supports people no matter where they're from or where they're being educated or where they plan to go. Those are 2 really powerful criteria for membership. So I think about that definition or understanding a lot. It was last developed 10 years ago. it's overdue to really have an inclusive process for our members to look at how we actually put that into something that has meaning for people, that isn't empty. We went back, maybe it takes me back to where we began. Why was my response embarrassing and insufficient? Because I was probably resting behind this big screen of global citizenship. But again, realize that that isn't, it doesn't mean anything if people can't attach to it or relate to it based upon their own experiences and perspective. So how are we going to do that? So I think for me, I'm really looking forward to, with the group we're going to put together, figuring out how we can turn that into something that will be inspirational to people, but also a means for change.
I'm also wondering specifically about the diversity within our own organization at CIS, particularly at the leadership and board levels. You know, of course, we want to enact these changes and influence our institutions, but we really should be walking the talk as well. And I'm curious your own perspective on how we could move the needle to achieve more diversity within our organization.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, it's one that the board talks about a lot. It comes up every single time we have to put forward a slate of candidates for election, which is open, by the way, only to leaders of school members. University members can join the board, but only by appointment. The board has been moving toward a more inclusive and diverse body in several ways. Several years ago, by appointing university members, for example, was a big first step away from just having school members represented in terms of the direction of the organization. But beyond that, they looked very carefully, the board, at our statement of criteria for what we would consider in elections or appointment to the board, and that was diversity is a big part of that. However, I think where we have been made progress was geographical diversity in terms of across the globe, ethnically, linguistically, different types of institutions, as we just mentioned, schools, universities, public, private, all those things came to bear. But once again, as with the definition of global citizenship, it's been insufficient. It has not introduced great diversity in race. And that is something, again, where I think we're going to have to more intentionally go about reaching out to people, looking at it. As we know, well, we've already talked about this. If you do look at leadership levels in our member institutions, there isn't a lot of color, for example, represented in that. So finding people who can bring the perspective we need on the board, who are more diverse, and would be a great thing. So again, that's a basic step. At CIS itself, with staff, when we appoint the leadership team, I was thinking back, our process, I can honestly say that in the last 10 years, I have not interviewed one person of color. And that's been based on a process that doesn't ask someone to declare their race or ethnicity, and we don't look at pictures, for example. But having said that, shortlisting people, there hasn't been one time that I've interviewed a person of color. And that's really too bad, which shows again that we have a lot of work to do to identify more diverse applicant pool and figure out how to encourage applications.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point that you're ending on as well. I think if we apply, that anti-racism lens to that particular issue of hiring diverse leaders, it would say that there's a structure that's already in place that's set up to kind of result in not that many people of color putting their names forward. And so to dismantle that structure will mean to be a bit more aggressive in recruiting and looking for people to encourage to apply. So I know you're very committed to that as well. And it's something that, I'm sure as we look at our structures, it'll be something that we can focus on moving forward.
So Yeah, and looking further at that, I'm really interested. You wrote a really powerful piece that's making a difference to a lot of people around the world, Nunana. I'm sure your life has changed quite a bit in the last few weeks as you think about that reaction, but probably because you made some very clear points and rationale for actions we could take. Can you just I'd like to hear more about those specific actions that would use an anti-racism approach and why you believe they would be effective.
Of course, before jumping into that, I do want to mention that I'm just one Black guy with, my own perspective. I'm not necessarily an expert. I don't speak on behalf of all Black people. It's just my own life experience that I'm sharing a little bit, things that I've picked along the way. That being said, I've been thinking about anti-racism as a paradigm since my college days, as part of an intentional community that was studying cross-cultural issues and living together actually, and really working through an anti-racist lens. So that's the first time I kind of came across that, more than 15 years ago. And just the whole perspective of racism as something that is so central to what we do, for me has never left me. It's always been something that's been, quite fundamental and actually surprising when I came into the international school setting to see that, people were kind of touting this whole perspective of global citizenship or international mindedness or these things without really looking at the perspective of, really scrutinizing the actual structures that they might already be benefiting from. It seemed like they'd missed a step. It's not that those things are wrong, it's that we've missed a step here to look at what are the actual structures we're benefiting from to actually dismantle. As Ibram Exendi says, um, the, um, the heartbeat of racism is denial. And the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. And so it's really important that we start from that perspective of realizing that we do have a lot to confess in terms of what we benefit from racial structures. And when we do, we can really unpack those. Yeah, as I wrote about, I had 4 recommendations. So the first one was around recruiting. So obviously, if we look at our international schools and universities across the board, they are mostly predominantly white educators who are in front of the children. And so if we're going to tackle the problem, we're basically propagating the problem if all we're doing is kind of showing a specific lens and a specific perspective. And as I dug into the issue further, it was pretty clear that international schools engage in certain discriminatory practices, such as requiring native language English. And when they say native language English, they go on to further specify from Britain, from the United States, these specific countries, which is strange because thanks to colonialism, there are so many countries around the world that instruct in English. So why that's a barrier, I don't really understand personally. And then there's the whole Western passports is another one that they'll say, you need to have passports from a specific country. And often schools and recruiting agencies will hide behind visa policies. Universities as well, it's the same situation. Hiring diverse staff, it's usually hidden behind some kind of visa policy. And I just wonder whether there's something that we can do collectively to kind of look at that structure, because um, I think it's sometimes a smokescreen that kind of deters from, you know, what some people have been known to say, which is, due to parental pressure or other pressures, they need teachers that look the part, look white or look or sound British or whatever it is, in order to project this view of what stereotypically people think of as an international school.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that the international community has a potential collective willpower that we could harness to shift the needle when it comes to hiring standards and saying, what does qualify. Yes, countries have certain visa restrictions that might be in place, but I wonder what it would look like for the collective international school community to lobby specific
Yes.
governments on those policies. I wonder what it would look like for credentialing to come together and say, let's create an international teacher's license or some other kind of credential that would then provide kind of access to folks regardless of where their nation of origin is.
Yeah.
And certainly the whole practice of native speaker, I think needs to die by the wayside. There's so many people who speak English or speak in the language of instruction. It's also common in other language of instruction schools too.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And yeah, and just a quick aside on that, we've recently started working really closely with TICEP, which is a professional organization of international credential evaluators. And there's some really powerful work going on in those groups that we can also attach to on this basis. Their sole purpose is to really understand how people are educated and break down these barriers and boundaries that stop people with certain credentials from certain countries going to other countries to live or work. So
Yeah.
I think that could be useful.
Yeah, to give an analogy, in my former institution, there was a time when international students weren't considered for scholarship funds because the rationale that was given was that we don't understand the credentials where they come from. So we don't know, because these scholarships require a certain grade to maintain the scholarship. We don't want to give somebody a scholarship from a foreign country because we don't know if they'll keep it. And all we had to do was reach out to credential evaluation agencies who were able to show us that there are credential equivalencies, and that was enough to kind of pass the muster. And I believe the same principle could be applied to teaching credentials from different countries around the world. So that was definitely, a first area that I think is fundamental to causing that shift, is changing the makeup of what these schools are in terms of the teaching perspective. And I believe that international schools are at different levels of influence where they might be able to start making change on that right now, when it comes to simple things like eliminating pictures or native language requirements. The second principle was around pedagogy. So again, the idea of the school culture, it's very much taught from a Western perspective. You learn a lot about the wars from the way the British might have fought it, or the Americans might have fought it. You might be living in a specific country at an international school and maybe not learning all that much about that country's perspective. And that seems strange to me, especially, when you see a growing number of local participants in international schools. It seems strange to only educate them in one from one lens. So, for me personally, I see the need to kind of shift curriculum in a way that would be, would honor, other non-Western perspectives and languages as well. That's really key. I talked in my article about my own personal experience growing up in schools, and it was this idea of like, you should speak English, this is the right thing to do. And so you felt a bit like an outsider speaking your own language. And I remember going back to my parents saying, no, I'm not speaking, Ewe, which is my mother tongue. We're not doing that because I'm speaking English now, because that's what's supposed to be. That's how it's supposed to be, because that's how powerful the influence was of the culture.
Yeah.
So
So
I think
that you
that's really,
never went back. So even today, you're not fluent in your own mother
yeah,
tongue.
yeah. I'm fluent in this at the extent that if people speak it to me, I know what they're saying to me.
Okay.
But I cannot come up with the words. It's a mental block. So, but that's certainly on a personal level. But I know there's similar stories of folks, kind of being told to kind of assimilate essentially, as opposed to celebrate the different unique perspectives that they bring, and also bring those to the table to shift our thinking, push us in new ways. I talked a little bit around international cooperation as well, because at the root of this whole racist structure is really something that's economic. It's been built in such a way that wealth is designed to flow towards Western nations. That's just how it is, and that's how student mobility works as well. And I wonder what education could do, in terms of being a powerful force to shift that trend and make it a truly global experience. We know education lifts so many people out of poverty, and we're at a time when online education is something that most institutions are investing in. So how can we, provide opportunities for students to access that same level of education? A lot has been happening with the MOOC movements. You see universities like University of the People, that are, that are educating thousands of students around the world through an online mechanism at very low cost. What could this look like if we kind of double down on this as a community? But also, how do we partner? Because it's not just about, again, perpetuating and saying, okay, only us in the West have the answers. How do we look at the local institutions that are also going on and doing their work and trying to be effective in their communities? And how do we find synergies to work together? That's a really key point. And of course, looking again with those wealth gaps, how do we, where we can, use our resources to empower and lift up high achieving low income students as well.
Yeah, the access to education throughout this pandemic has been really disturbing, isn't it, when it comes to the lack of access due to not having tools or connection or whatever. And, what's our social responsibility to, help with that? Certainly everybody's been struggling, but again, a whole section of children have been just left out of it.
Yeah. And I think there's a business case for this stuff. I understand, we're all struggling, but at the end of the day, if you can find a way to educate thousands of people at a fairly low cost, you could probably still make up for the investments that are made to make that effort happen. So I'm really intrigued about what this could look like for our communities, the ones that really put themselves out there to take those kinds of chances. So definitely, those three aspects, and then of course immediately with the Black Lives Matter situation, for me it's about saying, indeed, realizing that race is a central factor. It's something that is influencing, both the structures that we live and have grown up in, but also our own personal thoughts and feelings. And so it's very important for us to affirm and to loudly proclaim that Black Lives Matter. And anytime there's really incidents of these kinds of situations, just kind of continuing to put ourselves out there in solidarity, with those who are going through the pain. It's so fundamental, because the moment we say, okay, it's international and we're global citizens, and this might be an issue just for this one part of the world, and how do we, we can't speak for everybody in the world. It can easily indeed be a mask to kind of allow these feelings to perpetuate, and particularly around race, it's a global issue. The idea of dark-skinned people being a lesser than is not just an American issue. It's you see it in India, you've seen it in China, you see it in the Netherlands. Almost any community that I've actually lived in, I've seen racial discrimination take place. So I think it's important as communities that are parts that are in these locations where this takes place to loudly stand in support of those who are being oppressed.
Yeah, I can see that now, that silence is not an option.
Yeah.
And it's not useful, and we have to find a way to directly understand and demonstrate empathy, and learn more about what the actual damage that is happening is, how to go about it. I'm actually wondering, again, going back to immediate steps, our own colleagues at CIS. I'm thinking a lot about what actions we need to take at the workplace eventually, well, right now we're a virtual workplace. Eventually, hopefully we'll be back in the office also, but I'm very interested in talking about what kind of conversations, just to make space and time for people to gather together and talk about things that, might not even be appropriate or useful in a big group, but to rather put out specific topics and have some more views be shared. So those are the things that are on my mind. Some of them are very immediate, right in front of us and practical, and others, of course, broadly, because, we do have a big platform at CIS, and therein lies a big responsibility.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it again reminds me of another Kendi quote, which was, the opposite of racism is not racism or not racist. It is anti-racism. And so, it's not about us saying, oh no, we know we're not racist or whatever. It's about actually saying, yes, we do have certain racist structures, and we do need to address those, and both within ourselves and also structurally. And I believe, indeed, those personal gatherings and story sharing and vulnerability, I think, goes a long way, both to build our own team camaraderie, but also to make sure that we're really objectively, or critically, I should say, looking at where we might be parts of the problem, and really kind of taking those apart. I think there's lots of room for us as an organization, internally, to look at this, and whether it's through professional development exercises or book reading or other discussion groups that we can form. I'm sure we can start that process of kind of introspection.
Great. And so we will. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's just good to continue talking about this, because each conversation helps, move us forward and come up with new ideas. So
Yeah.
I'm learning a lot, and really grateful, for the time that we spent today to talk about this more intentionally.
Yeah, indeed. And I thank you a lot as well for making this space and kind of taking these steps here. I think it takes a lot of courage to say in a public format that, I wasn't where I should be, and my thinking has evolved and changed. I mean, how many of us change our thinking on a regular basis? So I think to be able to identify that, I think, is important, and it shows us a lot, kind of the way to go. I personally don't think I'm there yet either. I have so much to learn as well, and I'm looking forward to working together and kind of going through this journey myself.
Yeah. Great. To be continued.